Hello and welcome to this FinTech Wales webinar. FinTech Wales is a not-for-profit members organisation focusing on empowering fintechs and financial services across Wales. I'm delighted to see so many of you joining us here today. I'm your host, Sarah Williams-Gardner, and today I'll be joined by Ron Kalifa OBE. Today's webinar is kindly sponsored by global analytics providers LexisNexis. Firstly, forgive me, a shameless plug. Before we kick off, FinTech Wales is a membership organisation open to all Welsh fintechs and the supporting services companies who share our passion, making Welsh fintech a pillar of the global community, nurturing talent while connecting and enabling the sector's ecosystem. If you're not already a member, I'd encourage you to join us in amplifying our thriving Welsh fintechs on the global stage. Now, let me extend a metaphorical, warm, croeso yn Cymru, welcome to Ron. We're delighted to have you with us here, Ron, today.
Thanks, Sarah. Delighted to be here.
Wales is already a prominent place for fintechs, with companies like Confused, Wealthify, Delio having long-established roots here. But the publication of Ron's report has shone a spotlight on the fintech industry and acknowledges just how important it is for growth. It reinforces also Wales's position as a fintech hub, with Cardiff having been singled out as one of the top 10 emerging sectors in the UK. I know you'll be wanting me to encourage Ron to talk about the report, the levelling up, and what this means to us, and I will get on to that. Ron was asked to do this report because following his extreme contribution to the financial services sector and having been awarded the OBE in 2018 for his contribution to financial and technology services, he's highly regarded as a fintech leader. And it was this time last year, for those of us who've been listening to the budget, it was this time last year that Ron got that call, and we'll ask him how he felt about that when the Chancellor called him to lead on the independent fintech review. Now, before we go on to asking the questions of Ron, I'd just like to say a little bit more about Ron's background. He's currently the chairman of Network International and Future Learn. He also sits on various not-for-profit boards. He's a non-executive director of Transport for London and was appointed as a non-executive director for the Bank of England's Courts in 2019. And also something I know Ron is very proud about, because he's a passionate cricket player, is that he is also on the board of the England and Wales Cricket Board. Today, I'm going to be asking Ron, firstly, to take us through his career, sharing his journeys and experiences with us of a career that started at NatWest before moving on to RBS, where he took Worldpay, an underinvested division, to being a FTSE 100 listed company. I'm then going to be asking him to move on to the report, the recommendations that he's made, and talking us through some of those recommendations. And then lastly, I'd like to follow or end with the fact that we need to look forward. Following the report, which is a snapshot in time, and I'm sure Ron will talk to this, what do we need to do to make sure that we keep the UK as a forefront of the global fintech stage? Currently, we're rated as number 2, but what's really important is people are trying to catch up, and we've got to do all that we can to go ahead and stay in that position. So Ron, if you're okay, let me start by saying, let's take us through your career to date. How did you get into the industry? And on reflection, were there any decisions or forks in the road that had a big impact on your career?
Yep, thanks, Sarah, and really delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and also, importantly, I'm delighted that FinTech Wales is hosting this. Careers, how do you talk about a career? I mean, I joined what was called banking at the time without any real plan or understanding. It was one of those things that I'd applied for with NatWest. I got the job, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. If I'm honest, if you'd really asked me in terms of what I wanted to do, I suppose I wanted to play cricket. But I quickly realised that I was just never going to be good enough to play for the England team or the Wales team or for any team, frankly. So I went down a path of finance, and I did a series of roles, as you tend to in the kind of the schemes that you go into. So I did some operations, I did marketing, I did planning, strategy, all the usual groundwork. And I think it's really interesting when you reflect back, and I'm sure you and many of those who are listening to this and watching this will think about it in terms of, you don't tend to know what you know. So if someone said to you today, what do you know about banking? I would struggle to write down anything, but you can answer questions based on your experiences. So it tends to be about reference points that you build up through your career. And I think it's important that you think about it through reference points, because that's the only way to characterize what you've really accumulated and learned. And I did a bunch of, fairly non-specific jobs. I got frustrated several times when I felt I wasn't getting promoted in the way that I should have done. And there was one particular stage I can remember where I very nearly left the bank because I just felt I'm waiting for 3 years for a promotion, which is, which seems an eternity when you're in your 20s, and just didn't get breakthrough. And I kept being a bit of a pain, frankly. I kept talking to the supervisory team, the management team, and just saying, when's it my turn? When's it my turn? And one of the things that I think I learned at that stage was to be patient, but also to be pushy. And it's finding that balance between patience and pushiness, which I think is actually quite a delicate one. I'm not sure I mastered it, but eventually I progressed a bit more. And one of the things that I think was a fairly defining moment was I was working for the planning department in what was NatWest, and one of my friends was actually the PA to the chairman of NatWest. In those days, PAs meant chief of staff so he was doing that, and he said, I'm going on holiday for a couple of weeks. Do you fancy stepping in? And I was like, sure, how hard can it be? Now, the chairman at the time was a chap called Lord Alexander of Wheaton. He was a member of the House of Lords. He was a barrister. Lord Denning, who some of you may have come across historically, he described Lord Alexander, Bob Alexander, as the best advocate of our times. And he came in to do the role of helping NatWest at the time, because it was going through a whole bunch of issues. Blue Arrow scandal and all the rest of it. Anyway, he came in, and I went into work for him for 2 weeks. And I have to say, those 2 weeks were just... There's some feedback, hopefully you can still hear me. So those 2 weeks were really informative, because it helped me to understand a bigger picture in terms of what was going on in banking, what was going on in the world beyond banking. I always remember thinking that because I quickly learned that there were probably 60 people, I didn't count it, but that was kind of the way I thought about it, who basically everything that was going on in society, in British society, who were not in government. So quite often you would pick up tomorrow's paper, or today's paper as it would be, and know what was going to be on the front page, simply because he was a person who was so intertwined into every aspect of business and commerce and trade and sports and all sorts of things, frankly. So that was a great lesson in terms of working with him. But anyway, let me jump rapidly ahead, because I had a long career, if you want to think of it that way. And then I moved overseas for a number of years. And the reason I moved overseas was having done a job where you're at the center of a bank, a large bank. You make many friends, and you probably make a few enemies as well. So I took the view that I wanted to get as far away from the center as I could. So I was fortunate enough to kind of have many opportunities, I guess, at the time. So I asked, there was a new startup activity happening in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which none of you will have heard of, I suspect. It's in the middle of Pennsylvania, and it's an old mining town. So NatWest at the time had 350 branches in the States, in New York and New Jersey. And they wanted to put some operational activities, take the operation stuff out of the branches and put it into a back office, for a lower cost. So I became the COO, Chief Operating Officer, having had very little experience, in all honesty, to do anything like that. But literally, it was to start with a hole in the ground, a literal hole in the ground, to build some new premises and to start an operation there. which is still thriving. It had about 1,500 people we put in there at the time. And it was, one of my proudest moments, actually, from a finance point of view, to go there. I went with my then partner, who then became my wife. My son was born in the States, and we had the most amazing experience. So one thing I'd say to any of you is that if you ever get the chance to do something in a different jurisdiction, different country, take it, because these are about life experiences, and those are so important, I think, in terms of helping you grow and learn about what's going on in the world. Anyway, I came back after a couple of years, then went to, of all places, Bristol, in the insurance division, and started to take some interest in the internet as it was emerging at that point. And around the same time, NatWest had bought a business called Worldpay, which was not really a very significant business at the time, but the person I was working for sort of said, look, we bought this business, we don't really understand what it's about. It's something to do with the internet. You seem to do something in terms of insurance, which was the role I had, and the internet. Why don't you go and do something there? So I went to Cambridge, which is where it was. I was living in Kent at the time, and went to look at this business, and I had absolutely no clue about payments. I mean, no clue about payments. And I remember sitting in the first management team, and one rather cocky or awkward individual who'd been in the business for a number of years sort of said to me, so what are you going to do with the business? I said, I have no idea. I said, well, I'm going to learn from you, and I'm going to learn from you and your colleagues, and you're going to help me understand what this business is. At the time, it was 2002. The business had about 75 people. It was making a £7 million loss at the time. It had been created by a founder, Nick Ogden, talented guy who'd done a great job in that. But as he moved on, the bank asked me to go and become this chief executive. And the business started to grow relatively quickly through a series of activity. And the way that I sort of had an imprint in my mind was that there was a set of ingredients that I thought were pretty key. And I'd say that they're the same ingredients that have sort of held true for me in the years after as well. The first one was to decide that we're only going to operate where we can get to scale. And scale is about productivity, it's about unit cost and lowering the unit cost. So scale was important. The second was to ensure that we had clear visibility in terms of access to customers. So it was another ingredient in terms of where are we going to get customers from and how do we grow the business. The third one was technology. At the time, it wasn't called a technology platform, but it is now. So platform businesses, I think, are really important for future successes. And the last one was, because of financial services, was about regulation. So those four things were the sort of way that we thought about the business. And, we would come in the morning from all walks, there were only a few of us, and three of us would sit around the table literally at 8 o'clock every morning till 8:30 and talk about some of the issues that we're trying to face for the day. And it was literally hand to mouth, fighting to win customers. Our largest customer at the time was a customer called CD Wow, who had this amazing little model where they would package CDs from Jersey and send them out with music on them. And that was a huge customer. I think it was generating about £150,000 a year at the time, which was an enormous revenue stream for us at that time. But the business carried on growing. We merged it with a couple of other activities that NatWest had at the time. And thinking about scale, we won the Tesco contract. And once you win a contract like that immediately gave us a significant amount of scale in terms of the business. And then the business just carried on growing from there. We had about a 42% market share of the UK payments landscape within a few years. So it grew rapidly. And RBS, which took over NatWest, basically had a bunch of challenges that you'll be very familiar with and you'll have read about. So it had to basically define a bunch of assets that it had to be sold, because it had some state aid given to it. And in order to make sure that there wasn't an anti-competitive approach, one of the assets was Worldpay. So it was sold in 2010 for £2 billion to private equity, Advent and Bain International, who did a fantastic job. They were great supporters of the business. They invested another £1.5 billion. So £2 billion plus £1.5 billion. And then in 2015, we sold it for £6 billion and we listed it on the London Stock Exchange. So that was a tremendous journey, because basically when they bought it, every aspect of the business had to be rebuilt. I used to describe it as the largest startup in history, with 4,000 people, which is what we had at that time. But every process, every policy, so many people had to change as a consequence. Of the 4,000 people, we probably got rid of about 1,800 and recruited about another 1,100 to sort of change the grade, if you want to call it that, of the people who were there. And we were looking principally for people who were curious, people who were commercial, and also people who had hunger and a desire to learn. And that was the sort of criteria, and the business just continued to grow. Anyway, long story short, the business then in 2017 was sold 2 years later for £12 billion, forgive me. And then it merged again 2 years later into another company for 42 billion. Today it's probably worth somewhere in the region, market cap must be about 80, 90 billion, with 80,000 employees around the world. So that's a very quick snapshot of some of the twists and turns that I've had in my career.
Well, it goes to saying why the Chancellor felt that you would be a safe pair of hands to run this review. I think some of the things that I'm picking up there, Ron, from you in your career, you talk about being patient but pushy, you talk about being bold, you talk about putting yourself forward. These are very entrepreneurial characteristics, I would suggest, and you talk about taking on a business that was very much like a startup. And when we talk about fintechs, and we will come on to this a little bit further, we talk about people using fintech provision across the sector. Many people don't even realise they're touching fintechs, and I would suggest that Worldpay and some of the work that you did, payments is a little bit like utilities. We just expect it to work. We don't know how it works. Well, many of us don't. You'll be much more familiar than I will, but I know it's a very complicated and complex industry. And as you said, there are many people who have benefited from the RBS funds that came out. We've seen some fintechs growing from that, and I know my days at Starling have absolutely benefited and put all of that benefit back into the SME market to develop that and support businesses. So I'm seeing quite a few traits, Ron, in your style. And one of the things that I meant to say at the beginning is we are getting questions in live, but we have had an inordinate amount of questions in advance of this. So whilst we're going to try and get to all of your questions, we might not be able to get to all of them. And if we don't, we will address them and follow up with you. But Ron, one of the things that I wanted to ask you is what sort of approach to leadership would you want to share with this sort of audience? You talk about, as I said, patient, pushy, bold, often saying yes. But talk to me a bit more about your leadership, because you've already touched on cricket, and I believe, certainly from some of the conversations we've had, that you believe there's some learning between sport and business.
Yeah, look, I think it's really difficult to talk about leadership to anyone, because frankly, it sounds a bit pompous in some ways, and also a bit lectury. So I'm somewhat reluctant to talk about it, because it's about what worked for you at the time. And I think that's what leadership is about. It's about different situations and different activities as a consequence. I think the thing that I learned was there was an awful lot of things that I was pretty poor at. When I first started down this path, one of the things that I was pretty miserable at was actually the finances of a business. I had no real understanding of how to think about the finances and how to run a P&L. And what I tended to think through was that there were typically three types of roles that only come to you in terms of the full set of experiences when you're running an organization. They're typically about a P&L, owning a profit and loss business and being responsible for that. The second one is typically about people management, and the third one is about strategy. So it's only when you really start to get into sort of the more senior roles that you tend to have to do all three. But typically, as you're coming through, there'll be one or two, typically two, of those three that you are better at, that you're just much more natural at. And I think I would encourage all of you to ask yourself and be honest with yourselves about the things that you're not good at. And it's surprising. It's so simple to say it, but do recruit people who are better than you in many areas, because it will help you step away from the madness of running a business, because it is a mad activity. It's a flurry of activity that you've got to get onto, but it'll also help you focus on the things that are important. When you're running a business, you're an entrepreneur, but an entrepreneur has got a vision, but they can't do everything. They may think they can, and typically, I think, many of us tend to think that we can, but you're just not good enough at it. So hire people who are much better at you than at you in terms of those things. The second thing, I think, is, and it comes down to people again, is that I once read a quote which has always stayed with me, which is that if you think about leadership, you're walking up and down the corridors and people are talking about you at weekends to their family and friends. They're doing it all the time, whether you like it or not. And what they say depends on the experience that you have given them. So the quote I remember reading was that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And that is a real significant contributor. And I've been really fortunate in the sense that I've made many, many, many friends over the years that worked with me. And I like to think that, we treated them well, even when things weren't good. We treated them well, and they left businesses, if they left the business, with their head held high. And I think it's really important that that's something that stays with people going forward. The society is moving towards much more about business ethics and the way people feel and purpose. And I think that's an important facet for the future.
Yes, and I would agree with you on that. And one of the things that we've been asked in the questions in advance, and when you talk about people and how you make people feel, how do you encourage, or how have you encouraged in your career, that constant innovation, that focus on creating customer delight? And with regards to that, what sort of pain points do we think this market is going to have over the next 1 to 2 years, where we're going to have to encourage those colleagues to look at innovation and look at customer delights?
Yeah, look, I think quite often customers aren't talked enough about, and I think that was one of the learnings for me as well. You sort of think about it in a rather esoteric way, and there's something distant. I can always remember visiting a customer in Glasgow. It was a florist. I went there fairly early in the morning, about 5:30. I showed up at the shop. And it was just after chip and pin had been introduced, so you can imagine how many years ago that was. And I walked into the shop, and this lady was working furiously. She was on her own. It was a really small shop, no bigger than 10 by 10, flowers all over the place, water on the floor, bucket full of water in places. I went to look at the point of sale terminal to ask her, what was the experience like? And she said, oh, it's fine. And, after a couple of hours, we were talking about the business, how it was going. A very elderly lady, it must have been, 7 o'clock in the morning, a very elderly lady sort of wandered in, who was clearly a very regular customer in there. And she said, her usual flowers, whatever they were, so she bought them. She gave the lady the card, her payment card. And the woman said, no, you've got to put your PIN in now. She said, oh, yes, my PIN. Shopkeeper, the lady, the florist, opened a drawer, and in there was literally an A4 piece of paper with names, top to bottom, with different PIN numbers on them, all the way up and down. And it just reminded me that, real businesses have real issues that they kind of try and work through. So it is important that customers are at the forefront of your thinking. One technique that we tried and did, and it sort of worked for a while, were a couple of things. Firstly, to ensure that all the people in the relatively small business of Worldpay at the time went out, whether you were in development, whether you were in operations, whether you were in risk or controls or whatever, you were out with customers, and you spent one full day a month with customers. People used to whinge about it, frankly, quite a lot, but they would come back informed and educated, and quite often things got unblocked because of it. Another thing that we did, which was a sort of learning from Bezos and Amazon, was that when we had our team meetings, we would have multiple conversations about, as you say, the complexity of payments and all sorts of things. There would be an empty chair in the room. And whenever we were talking, we want to make sure that we talk to the empty chair. And the empty chair was either, I used to call it either Nelly, who used to work in Gateshead at the time, was in our call center, or a customer. So whenever we got into the depths of it, just say, okay, explain what you've just gone through and explain it to Nelly. And it was a real leveler of helping people to kind of, frankly, just ground back to what are we trying to do? What are the real issues? So those were a couple of the lessons that kind of, came to the fore.
I think that last one is a really interesting one, because I think we often forget our why and our purpose, and we can get caught up in our own technology and our own language sometimes. So like you, Ron, I believe the customer is always at the forefront, and both of us have had the opportunity of delivering customer solutions and, keeping the customer in the forefront and going out and actually testing the products and listening to people can really change the way that you drive your business. I feel as though I could talk to you about your career for a lot longer, but given that the burning part of this is on the Kalifa report, I want to move us on now onto your review. Your review was released last Friday. It's been warmly welcomed. Could you just talk us through how you felt when you got that call and this huge task just over 12 months ago when the Chancellor called you to say, could you please give me a strategic review on FinTech? How did you tackle it? And what are the main recommendations you've come out of the report with?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It was a bit daunting, is the sort of simplest way to describe it. You can imagine the sector is not really that well defined, and many people have, I think, a really bad impression of the sector because they don't realize they're using the services of a fintech for their everyday activities. It might be an online banking app, it might be transfer money around the world, it might be SME lending, whatever it is. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's in there. So it was pretty daunting and scary, but I think the way I tried to tackle it was really to try and assemble a small group of people and start talking to several people about what's on their mind. And I remember spending a lot of time with, in particular, to try and actually understand what was uppermost in the minds of them and some of the challenges that are being faced at a local level. Because I do think that this is about local as much as about central activity. And then I came to the sort of broad conclusion that the way to think about it was to think about it through 5 different lenses. One was about policy and regulation. The second one was about skills and talent. Thirdly, about national connectivity or levelling up. Then about investment. And finally, about international attractiveness and competitiveness. And Sarah, look, it's a sector which is growing rapidly. And maybe I could just put some context in terms of where I thought about it. A sector where it plays, I think, very well to the agenda that's probably being talked about as we speak by the Chancellor in terms of today's budget that he's unveiling. But it speaks to jobs, it speaks to inclusion, it speaks to international trade, levelling up and innovation. People listening on this, you're all very experienced in this particular sector, and many of you are driving the change for society. It's also, I think, a sector which is becoming much more relevant as jobs in financial services are changing rapidly and significantly. It's a sector that's employing over 1 million people when you think about financial services. And I think we've got to almost start to move away from talking about FinTech, but because if I talk to any of the CEOs of the largest banks, they would say they're a FinTech. And that's the way that we need to think about it. This is essentially about technology-enabled businesses that are driving outcomes from a finance point of view. And this is about bringing innovation into mainstream banking with robust regulation. And I'm a big believer in making sure that regulation plays a part. From a UK point of view, or from a global point of view, the sector is worth about £100 billion today and growing threefold to about £380 billion. We have got a dominant market position in the UK. And a dominant market position means that we've got a 10% market share. And it's the strength of it is, I think, underpinned by a series of very strong factors. Firstly, investment into UK FinTech stood at just over $4 billion last year. That was that level of investment in the UK was more than the next 4 European countries combined. Germany was next with 1.4 billion. Secondly, I think we've got really strong capability in terms of people and in the financial services space, in the technology space. And thirdly, I think we've led the world, and led the world is really important to think about. We've led the world as it relates to policy-led innovation. Think about the sandbox that we've got, think about open banking. These have been pioneering activities that we've done. And I was quite pleasantly surprised that we were the first ones to launch the sandbox in 2017. But now there are 50 different countries who have launched their own sandboxes. So what that's telling me is that the world is watching what we're doing, they're copying what we're doing, but they're trying to catch up as well. So the need for the review was, I think, pretty critical to try and get it right. But also, COVID has been an accelerator for digital adoption. Many of our businesses have experienced that. So it was the right time to be doing a review and creating a strategic model for how do we tackle these issues around skills, around investment, around levelling up, etc.
Yeah, I think, as you said, timing sometimes is everything. And the pandemic and COVID, whilst it's caused an enormous amount of pain for so many people, we have seen that huge adoption of digital. And I think there's a statistic out there that says that there were 6 million people who downloaded a banking app for the first time in that first month of the pandemic. That's 12% of the population who have adopted mobile banking, possibly going on a journey of behavioural change that most probably won't come back. Ron, in doing your report, you corralled quite a lot of people. I think some 500 people were involved in contributing towards the report, and I'm not going to pull any of those names out, but I would like to just ask you, where did you experience the biggest challenges? And if you were to have any concerns about the recommendations that you've made, be they in the policy area, the investment area, the levelling up area, or the skills, what concerns do you have about those being implemented?
Yeah. Sarah, look, when a report like this is done, as you and others will know, the first task is basically try and get some level of consensus. You can't get consensus when you're doing anything of this scale. But I've been really positively encouraged by, I would say, 99% of the feedback that I've had. Obviously you're going to get a couple of people here or there who are unhappy because X has been missed out or Y has been missed out. But I think broadly there's been consensus in terms of what we've put together. And all I've done is principally convened and brought some things together. Now the task and produce a report which has been submitted, as you said, to government. It's up to the Chancellor now to review it, reflect on it. He's already made some comments in the weekend press, which was actually very positive, around the scale-up visa, for example, that it was one of the recommendations that was in the report, because I think it's really important that we continue to make sure that businesses have continued opportunity for fast-track visas for international fintech talent. And I think this new visa stream that we're suggesting, I think is going to be embraced. Pre-Brexit, hiring EU talent was quite simple, thanks to free movement. EU nationals could just relocate around Europe for work, etc. But with Brexit, it's actually a harder thing. It's added significant barriers, including costs and time, about 8 weeks now, whereas before it was more or less a speedy activity. So that's one of the things that's been suggested. Where do I think there's going to be some challenges? I think it's difficult to tell, because I think the feedback I've had so far suggests that most of the things seem like sensible things to do. Things won't happen overnight, and I want to be very open and stress that. This is about policy changes in the main, in terms of putting together certain packages, a digital finance package, thinking about a trade policy. I mean, these are long-term things, but there are many things which will be much more immediate, I hope, including one area that I'm particularly passionate about, and you know that, is about local activity. I think that national connectivity or levelling up has been something that is absolutely crucial. One thing that surprised me was that whilst we've got a significant number of bodies up and down the country who are very well intentioned to try and do what they can for their members, there's about 30 different organisations by interest across up and down the country. They haven't been coordinated, they haven't been working as effectively. So one of the things that I've suggested is that we have identified clusters, and those clusters are opportunity. Wales is one, especially Cardiff and South Wales. It's got strengths in insurtech, it's got strengths in cybersecurity, it's driven by Admiral, Money Supermarket. Cardiff is a key location for Monzo, for Starling, as you know. So what I want to do is to make sure that we can connect better across the country and start thinking about centres of excellence much more so. And that's one feature that I think is going to be important to kind of make sure works, because in the current model, it has not been working particularly well. Now, many wouldn't want me to say that, but over a third of all fintechs are outside London. London is a hub, of course it is, but there are these clusters at different levels of maturity. And these clusters, these cities, these locations, are basically underpinned by proximity to foundational capabilities. Typically, there's existing financial services or technology domain expertise, but they've also got very high numbers of education establishments in the cluster area, typically 3 or more. And they've also got homes for accelerators. And the potential uplift from a GDP point of view, including with jobs, is enormous. So that's one of the things that we're really keen to kind of push. And I will need help from you and the others up and down the country to try and bring that to life. But I think for too long, people have been shouting loudly in their own areas without thinking about it in an overall strategic way. And I'm hoping that that's one thing that we can bring to the fore relatively quickly.
Yeah, and Ron, when we are working in different times, it'll be our absolute pleasure to invite you down to Wales, because one of the things I think you've learned through this process is just how passionate this region is. And yes, quite often we talk about that connectivity, and you will know, and I often use the analogy that the requirement for the local knowledge, the likes of myself, the team, the members here in Wales, and members, be they in Scotland, Northern Ireland, the North East, the West, etc., across the country. What we need to do, and really sorry to any English people on this call in bringing a rugby analogy into this after the weekend, but what we need to do is we need to be looking for the talent. I on behalf of Wales and with all of the members that are part of us and our community, we need to be looking for the Alan Wynne Joneses. We need to spot them. We need to take them from Swansea. We need to put them into Cardiff, and we need to get them to play for Team GB. This is about global Britain on that global stage, and I know this is something you feel very passionate about. So it's you have our commitment. We're looking forward to being around the table with you, Ron, to understand, to getting this to work. I know one of the recommendations you talked about is what we're fondly referring to as CFIT, the Centre for Innovation, Financial and Technology. We're keen to see how that develops, and we're keen to play a very, very active role in it in order that we can support something that, again, I know you believe is vital, which is local leadership, being able to corral and identify that talent so that we can push it forward onto the global British stage. So we talk about that, and your commitment has come across loud and clear. Where when we look at Wales, and you will have seen for yourself some of the brilliant talent that we have and some of the businesses we've had, and you've just alluded to what makes a successful cluster, successful financial services institutions, and you've already mentioned Admiral, and Wales has an awful lot to thank Admiral for. Educational establishments being 3 or more, and we absolutely have those, but you also identify accelerators. Now that's something that here in Wales we are starting to look at, and that's why Cardiff is an emerging fintech hub, because we have some other things that we can do to ensure that we grow and come up to the same level as some of the other already established super hubs across the UK. But when we look at Wales, Ron, from your perspective, and given what we've already developed and the strong reputation we have, where do you see our opportunities for further growth, for further collaboration, and especially on the international stage?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I mean, I think Wales is interesting. There was a session with the Prime Minister where I talked a little bit about the levelling up agenda, and I referred to, I think, as levelling up meets global Britain through the work that we're doing in terms of the review. And that was the characterisation. And I talked about some examples up and down the country. I talked about Wales as well. But in Wales, you've got Confused.com, which is headquartered in Cardiff. You've got Starling, who's expanded into Wales, and it created, 100 jobs last year, I think, there. ULO was started just over a year ago. 400, okay. ULO was started, you'll know that well. ULO was started just over a year ago by a very talented individual, and he pivoted his business during COVID to support remote contactless. Senseforth AI is an early stage AI business which supports fintech. Delio, the list just goes on. So I think the opportunity is considerable in terms of that. What I would hope happens, and I'm using the word hope because the review has yet to be formally responded to by the Chancellor and by John Glenn. But I would like to find a way that we set up, as you rightly said, this Centre for Finance, Innovation and Technology. I would want Wales and the other regions to be part and parcel of the governance of that, to try and help to ensure that it succeeds going forward. That is about coordinating activity. It's about bringing things together. And more importantly, it's about success for the future. But I would love to see that collectively, this adds up to, I think, a very strong pipeline of companies that are creating IP across the UK, and to allow them to take them to the sort of the global marketplace. I think internationalization is such an important part of the fintech agenda. I've been staggered when I did the work to see the feedback that was coming through from Australia, from Singapore, from Canada, from France. And they were all saying exactly the same thing, that we tend to look at what you do and we copy it. And that's exactly what, so we've got to make sure that we keep ahead by ensuring that we've got this international plan of action, 2.0 as I've called it in the review, which is essentially a targeted activity to help. Another recommendation was to launch and establish CFIT and the International Finance Task Force, as I called it. So that will be opportunities where you and your colleagues can go and sell their wares, showcase them with the government's backing. It makes an enormous difference if you've got a government minister on a trip like that talking about your business. It's an endorsement. So it's those opportunities that I think we've got to capitalize on. And frankly, I think we will, because the government has got the same agenda as a fintech entrepreneur. They want the business to grow and they want jobs to be created. So I'm very positive and very hopeful about where this is going to go.
Yeah, and I think, when you talk about these central organisations and you talk about support for local leadership, I think I've certainly heard you or your colleagues through this review process saying, you talk about Australia, you talk about Singapore, and what are they doing? They're copying us. But when they copy us, they actually put resources behind it. And I think this is a pivotal moment, Ron, to actually put those resources behind what has been an amazingly successful sector. And I also, hear what you're saying, that fintech is something that we need to sort of blend into the financial services, because technology is going to deliver all of the changes that we have going forward, whether it's the fact that we've already got and we're benefiting from PSD2, open banking. We've got to start thinking about where we're going forward. We've got to start thinking about open finance, open data, which will lead on to digital ID and a plethora of other things. And we, in order to retain that position on the global stage, we've just got to keep pushing the boundaries. We've got to keep these other countries looking at us to see what we're doing and where we're going next. So I think, you're right, it's very exciting. But I think the other thing we have the opportunity to do here when we look at these central bodies is also just to share with the wider world. We know that skills and talent is a constant area of focus for us. We're looking for highly skilled people. We're very proud here in Wales that we are supporting the Kickstarter scheme. We're very proud that the members of FinTech Wales have absolutely embraced that, and they are offering high quality. And that's the thing about this industry, is I've heard you saying, and plenty of others, these are high quality jobs. But there is part of this work that we need to do to share what our industry is about and how people can come into that industry, because it's not just engineers. There's a plethora of broad jobs there. So I think the other thing, Ron, I'd just like to draw you on the skills area, because you've been talking about retraining, upskilling. What would you like to really see come out of this from the skills perspective to make sure that we have that pipeline of talent here in the UK?
So I think there were two sets of issues or challenges that were being highlighted throughout the review as it related to skills. The first one was cost, and the second one was quality. A lot of their teams need to be upskilled and retrained. But the cost of courses is considered too high, especially for senior education, executive education, if you want to call it that. And the second one was that in terms of quality, there's a lack of clarity as to which training providers are credible and who can offer the right courses going forward. So we've created, we've suggested a recommendation, which is to retrain and upskill adults to meet the needs of the sector, UK FinTech sector, by ensuring access to short courses from high-quality education providers at a relatively low cost. We are going to set up a small group that helps to do a couple of things. Firstly, to understand the current and the future skills gap. Secondly, to communicate those needs with government and education providers. And thirdly, to endorse and promote appropriate courses at a reasonable cost. We are well on our way, literally since the review was published on Friday, a few days ago. Sherry Kutu, who was leading this chapter for me, has done some tremendous work and has also already started to put in place many of these activities that we have talked about. So I'm very positive and hopeful that we will be able to marry up and help you and your colleagues upskill talent and capability, because it's only through doing that will we stay relevant and will you be able to grow going forward. So that's a critical recommendation that I think has already come to life. And just before I joined, I was briefly watching the Chancellor talk about the budget speech, and he made a reference to specifically the Kickstarter scheme that many of you will know. And that's another leg that was a particular framework for this sector. So, Sarah, I think there's a lot of opportunity here to actually ensure that the people we've got are fit for purpose for the future, and we can compete on a global stage.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And as I said, we're fully embracing the Kickstarter program, and we're delighted to be part of that with jobs out in the market already. And I know from the businesses that I've started to talk to here in Wales, that appetite for lifelong learning is certainly something I'm seeing in many of the leaders of the fintech businesses, financial services businesses. They recognise that there is some retraining that needs to be done. So, we will be hungry for those short courses to make sure that we have a workforce that is fit for the future. So that's really exciting to see that those things are coming. And I said it's good to see these all coming in together. Ron, if I was to ask you, we've talked we've talked about the review, we've talked about your recommendations, and we've started to go into after the review and what we need to see actually happening. And we've talked about the skills work, you've talked about what Sherry Kuto is doing for you, you've talked about the Centre for Innovation and Financial Technology and how you're going to bring everyone together to create that and ensure that the governance is embracing of all of the UK. If you were to have the luxury of looking back 5 years from now, if you had one wish, what would you want to see as a result of the year of work that you have put into creating this report? And I dare say many years afterwards that you will be that you will remain committed to this, to ensuring that it gets put into practice. But if you were to have one wish and you were to look backwards, what would you like to be seeing?
Yeah, it's almost a bit glib to say that the recommendations from the review are adopted, embraced, and embedded across the whole of society. But I think it's a bit more than that. I think we've got to collectively work to ensure that people don't think about this as fintech. I would be thrilled if that expression just disappeared within the next few years. And basically, this becomes a way of doing business. It's a way that the financial services has matured over the last 5 years, as it would be. I think that would be the best thing to think about, because many of the large incumbents need the help of many of the people who are watching this and are active members of organizations such as yours. Because those large organizations, and I was part of them when I was in the bank, have got legacy systems, and they want to do the right thing. They want to do the right thing for their customers, but their systems are so constrained. So finding ways to work with entrepreneurs to ensure that solutions are created that make lives better for consumers, for small businesses, for society generally, would be a tremendous achievement in terms of where it would be. And that collaborative model, which is still dogged a little bit by suspicion. Typically the large players don't want to have too many small players come in because, one, they're going to be judged from a regulatory point of view if something goes wrong, and the responsibility is theirs, and it's a big burden to bear. The second is a lack of trust sometimes, that if I open up my data sets and let a small business in, are they going to nick my customers? And that's just something we've got to change the mindset. So we've got to get to a level of trust and opportunity. So, Sarah, that's the sort of stuff that I think would be really important to think about. So it's embedded, and it's no longer talked about as fintech.
And as you said, it does go across the whole of the financial services sector. So that's really interesting, and it heartens me to hear what you're saying, because the strategy here at FinTech Wales is about that collaboration, and we will. We're very proud of what we're looking to build, which will be a foundry going forward to have that environment where we can collaborate, where we can have the established financial services and the fintech businesses, which are not all small businesses, they're quite substantial businesses, but where they can share that learning, where they can share that way of working, where we can get those agile processes going and we can actually benefit the whole of the sector. So I feel we're sort of starting to go along that journey, and maybe when we open our foundry, that might be the time that you come down and physically come to Wales, because I think you'd be really proud of what we're aiming to do there. Ron, we're sort of coming up to the end of the hour, and I just wanted to go to some of the questions that we have had in. One of the questions that we've got here, if you're okay with me to move on to those, is has this review, in your mind, taken into account the social and environmental purposes of fintech?
Yeah, I would like to say yes. Could we have done more? Probably, yes. But the reality is that I think the social and environmental opportunities are across society now in terms of the way we think about this. So this is about improving financial inclusion. This is about the green agenda that's there. And I've not tried to talk about the green agenda very actively, because I'm taking the view that it's now something that's going to be part of the psyche, part of the business agenda going forward. So maybe I haven't called it out enough to the question that's being asked, if that was the sort of the place someone was going. But I think it's part and parcel of making sure that lives are improved through fintech and the work that we do, because that's the only way to judge ourselves in terms of the future.
Yeah, and as you said, we're seeing green finance, and certainly with the with the Green Finance Institute, there's most probably some collaboration with your Centre for Innovation, Finance and Technology that can happen there. I think these things are often judged by customers, and I think we're seeing customers today actually questioning the suppliers, and they are wanting to see their ethical policies and actually seeing them come good on those and deliver true to them. So, I know you've talked about it in your review. Maybe not everything worked its way into the report. A difficult thing to get in there, but good to hear your thinking on that one. I think just moving on, we've also got a question here which says, what lessons can we learn from developing countries from their experiences and their successes in fintech? And we might be a very quick answer to this, because personally, I often think that they're not sort of bogged down by the legacy that we have here in this country. And you've talked about the established financial services organisations that are often a little bit hamstrung by legacy. But would you share other thoughts where you think we can learn from developing countries?
Yeah, look, I think developing countries are very focused on growth. Because that's the way for them to kind of move away from being a developing country to being a developed country. If you look at most of them, technology plays a huge part because it's a leapfrog opportunity for them. They can start to move away from the legacy issues, exactly as you said, Sarah, and that's where they're focused. That's where their governments are focused, to ensure that they can jump ahead, a generation, if you want to think of it that way, in terms of technology. So we've just got to make sure that we keep watching that and learning from them in the same way as they're learning from us.
And Ron, as we see the digitisation, and we've seen this huge adoption of digitisation through the pandemic, and it's not just in financial services and downloading mobile banking apps, but also the adoption of Zoom and the way that we're all living and working. And to a certain extent, I know because we're confined to homes at the moment, we're using those more, and I'm sure everybody's looking forward to getting back to seeing people in person. But there is a change that is happening. There is a behavioural change that's happening. What concern, if any, do you have about the move to the cashless society? Do you see that as leaving people behind? And what should we do to make sure?
Yeah. I think cash is a vital ingredient for society, and it's going to continue. So I would hope and really want to make sure, and I think Natalie Senior did some work on this access to cash about a year or so ago, and that was a really critical moment to ensure that government, ministers, officials understood the importance of cash for aspects of society. The elderly, those who can't get access, who haven't got access to technology in the same way. But the reality is that if you turn it the other way around, in terms of the world is moving forward, and again, we talked about this a little bit in the report, but there are many things that are going to be important for the future. We have to have a much more better understanding in terms of data strategy. We have to have a method to develop and adopt common data standards. We have to think about, what does a digital ID really mean? And what will that do for society? We have to think about prioritizing smart data. We have to think about central bank digital currency. We have to think about the regulatory implications of AI, artificial intelligence. Those aspects are not going to go away. What I would hope is that we have built up over 300, 400 years a level of trust in the financial system of the UK. That trust is going to continue, but we've got to make sure that we shape it going forward, so that some of these initiatives that I've just referred to, because that's what they are at the moment, become part and parcel of society, so that we set the standards, we set the protocols for how they should be adopted, not just within the UK, but they set the global standards. Because I think the world is looking to us to ensure that we can do that. CBDC, central bank digital currency, is already being embraced and adopted within China. But is that the standard that the world wants to adopt? Question mark. If we were to do something, and the Bank of England is doing a lot of great work in that, then it plays a part in making sure that society is operating in a more efficient way, in a more regulated way, and in a safer way. So those are the ways that I think we've got to do it. But cashless is a broad term, Sarah, but it has digitization is here to stay, and we've got to embrace it and find a way to adopt it and shape it for the future.
And you're absolutely right. It is that research and development, that innovation side. And, we're lucky enough to have some phenomenal universities here in the UK. And we've also got some very good research and development organisations which are really keen to look at how we make sure we have those data standards. Because the one thing that we all know is as data and technology and all of these things become ubiquitous, the power is going to be in when we can talk to them and when we can integrate with them seamlessly and when we can use AI and machine learning to the advantage of the consumer at the end of the day. And we have been seen as the world leaders in PSD2 and open banking, and there's a lot more that we can do on that front. So it's a very exciting time. I think there's much that we can do. Ron, we're just coming up to the hour, so I'm going to actually thank you for your time. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's my delight to be able to work with you going further forward, and I'm really looking forward to whatever the Chancellor sort of looks at from your report, and hopefully many of the recommendations are going to be embraced. And as you quite rightly said over the weekend, he was very, very positive. I think I heard him mention FinTech 3 times when he talked to Andrew Marr on Sunday. So you've done a great job in educating people about FinTech, the power of FinTech and what this means to the country, what it means for jobs, what it means for people, what it means for the UK as being at the forefront. Ron, are there any comments that you would like to just close off with? I know your report actually sort of ends with, now let's just get it done. But would you like any final words before I close out?
Thanks, Sarah. Look, I know that there'll be thank you and the team and everyone that's been involved in helping to bring the report to life in terms of recommendations. I also want to wish all of the people who are watching this and listening to this success, because many of you will be entrepreneurs, many of you will be thinking about your businesses. I think that you are on the cusp of a kind of a revolution in terms of FinTech being reimagined. And I think that, please play your part, please have your voice heard, participate in forums such as FinTech Wales and others to ensure that you can shape the future for society, because that's the agenda that we're trying to drive to. So thank you for having me here, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Ron, that's absolutely fantastic. As we say here in Wales, diolch yn fawr. I thank you to you for your time and being very candid with your answers. I'd also like to thank LexisNexis Risk Solutions, who not only have helped us bring this to fore today, but also to Alison and Rob behind the scenes who've been managing everything for us. Your help and support has been much appreciated. Ron, thank you. This is the beginning, not the end. I'm really looking forward to working with you going further forward. Take care. Bye-bye.